Thank you. So yeah, you guys have probably been around flameworking for long enough to understand that flameworking demos are just really, really boring. And the particular kind of flameworking that I do is even more boring than that. So for that reason, and also just to like justify my presence up here, I have put together a little slideshow to just introduce you to what on earth it is that I'm doing and why I'm here or whatever. So I'm going to just move over here to my computer screen, and I think that you can see things up there. It's a pretty short little slideshow. So yeah, my name is Kit Paulson, and I've been working with glass for about 18 years. I grew up outside of Chicago, Illinois, right smack in the middle of the country, and I was raised by hippie back-to-the-lander types. Spent a lot of time outdoors making stuff. This particular slide is me holding a chicken and looking kind of slow on the uptake. I chose to do my bachelor's at Alfred University in Western New York State because it was really far away from my hometown, and it seemed to just be full of people passionately making stuff, which I think is really great. And I went in with the intention of studying painting, which is not a good idea. And I took glass my second year of school for really no particularly good reason. Just kind of, I was there, it was there. When was this ever going to happen again? And I was utterly horrified at first, because it's like really hot. Glass is really hot if you're not expecting it. And so after my first gather out of the furnace, I went out in the hall and just kind of cried a little bit and wished that I had signed up for something else. But somehow that horror turned into fascination. I think that's like a thing that happens, horror turning into fascination. And by my senior year, I was doing very little else other than blowing glass. And this image is an image from my BFA show. And about a year after I graduated, I had the wonderful opportunity to be a teaching assistant for a friend while he was teaching a 2-month-long class at Penland School of Crafts in North Carolina. And this was my first introduction to a place that has turned out to be highly influential in my understanding of the nature of making things. After the class, I had every intention of moving down to Penland, and then for various reasons, I ended up back in Chicago working production glass jobs, making production work, and eventually making my own production line and doing the craft fair circuit. And it took me kind of a while to realize that I just hated every second of it. I was making objects solely for the purpose of making money. They were not objects I liked or was proud to have my name associated with. I disliked the dishonesty that comes with selling objects that you make but do not like. The people who were buying things from me thought that they were buying heartfelt, earnest things, in some way buying a connection with the maker. But in fact, I felt that I was just making and selling mindless product. And I kind of felt like a charlatan. So fast forward like 7 or so years of that, just production, no art making. Coming out of my BFA, I had been somewhat disillusioned with art making. It seemed pretty selfish and pointless. I had never really been able to answer satisfactorily for myself why art making is a worthwhile endeavor. After all, when making art, it is unlikely that you are doing anything with concrete, practical worth. You are not curing diseases or feeding the hungry or even building roads. More on that later. But in the frustration of making things that I really didn't like, I realized that I wanted to make art again, even if I couldn't quite see the point of it still. I missed the mental activity of art making. And around that same time, I started messing around with flameworking for the first time. And I also rented my first studio space, which is a really good strategy for just like making yourself make stuff, because there you are, you're paying for this space, and you feel kind of obliged to be doing things in there. Yeah, you know, you have to come up with strategies to get yourself to do things. So these are some of the pieces that I made around that time, which incorporated both furnace glass and flameworking. And these are all soft glass. I hadn't discovered that borosilicate existed yet. And I started trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to make. It does not seem like it should be that hard to figure out what you want to make, but it was strangely difficult for me, and I think that's a common experience, and that's kind of worth recognizing. It's something that should be super easy, after all. When you make art, you're allowed to make absolutely anything in the whole world. That's kind of the point. But sifting through the whole world to discover that one thing that will satisfy your own criteria, which you are writing as you go along, that part's really hard. And merely figuring out which constraints you'll choose to work within is hard. And I kept hitting things and thinking, that's not quite it. Like, you're getting warmer, but that's not it. That's not the thing you're looking for. And I continued to do the craft fair circuit, hating it more and more with each passing second, and trying to develop my own work on the side. The absolute low point being a summer spent blowing glass at a Renaissance fair. Though I have to admit that I kind of like I like costumes. It's fun to like make costumes and wear them. Anyway, so through a fortuitous series of coincidences, I ended up as a teaching assistant for a class at Oxbow School of Art in Saugatuck, Michigan. The class is called Optics of the Lens, Intersections in Glass and Video. And it just could not have been further away from hawking glass junk at fairs. It was a class that involved a lot of messing around with glass and video and optics and conceptual concerns, and it was, for me, a glorious breath of fresh air. I got really interested in making glass objects specifically to shoot photos and video through. And this slide up here, this is a box of optical devices that I made, and there were water lenses and kaleidoscopes and concave black lenses called clawed glasses and mirrors and everything I could imagine pointing a camera through. I love the distortions of detail and color that happen shooting video through optical devices. And I loved how the images captured the light of the scene with very few recognizable details. I loved how you could recognize the season and the time of day without a lot of visual clues other than light and color. I was making all these things that I liked a lot, and I didn't really know what to do with them. I tried images without objects I find that unsatisfying somehow. So I tried making objects to project images and video onto. And this one is a glass screen made out of leaves that I cut out and fused onto a panel. And they were kind of invisible until the video was projected onto them. But being finished with a piece and only having a photo or a video and not having a three-dimensional object or relying on projection to complete a three-dimensional object was not what I was looking for. One thing that's really important to me about making things is that feeling of finishing a three-dimensional object and knowing that it can exist on its own in the world, that it is self-contained. I had by this time managed to get myself out of the craft fair circuit and was instead teaching classes at a local public access glass studio, which allowed me more time to work on my own work and a little bit more certainty, and it was less soul-crushing than craft fairs. So I started out the year 2014 with a trip back to Penland, which just reminded me of how much I love craft and making things out of glass. And seeing other people doing beautiful things with materials is really important to me. I think it's very, very difficult to make art in a vacuum, to just make art by yourself without other people around. So it was just one of those excellent moments of like, oh yeah, this is why I wanted to do this in the first place. Everything makes sense. I was super excited about making things. I came back to Chicago and started making all these little intricate, delicate components and putting them in these bell jars. These are all soft glass, still no boro. And I was looking at a lot of objects produced around the 17th century when science, art, and decor seemed to have not really sorted out what belonged to whom. And this is a time period and subject matter that continues to interest me, that I keep wandering back into. I was super happy with what I was making, had all sorts of ideas, and the year was going to be super exciting. And then I got diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, which just like really put a damper on things. So Hodgkin's lymphoma is very curable and treatable. It's like cancer light, but I was going to have to go through at least 6 months of chemotherapy. So I decided I wanted to make a piece to record the time spent. I didn't really know what was going to happen. So I made a silhouette of myself on my studio wall in tiny, tiny little flamework flowers. And every couple of days or weeks, I would add another layer to it so that it expanded outward. And I took a photo of myself in the silhouette every time I added to it. And then I compiled the photos into a stop-motion video, which should be playing. Is it playing? It is playing. And making this piece ended up answering questions I didn't really even know I had been asking. It was pretty pivotal. And it put me closer to answering that unanswered question of art. What is it good for anyway? And the way I currently see it is this: that one condition of being human is to be walking through the world alone. you are the only one in the world who completely understands you. Not in like an adolescent, nobody understands my life, emo, wallowing in misery kind of a way, but in a practical way. It is quite impossible to really truly understand things in exactly the same way that somebody else understands. And I'm not saying that you can't get close, just that there will always be a gap. And that gap is the aloneness of being human. And if in making art you are able to make something that says to another person, somebody else is out here too, we share something, it can make that gap feel a little bit less wide. And I tend to think that making that gap feel a little bit less wide is a pretty worthwhile pursuit, I guess. And that is possibly one value of art. I don't know anything about anything. So just as I was getting done with chemotherapy, I got the opportunity to have a solo show at a local university gallery. And because I had been too sick to work for most of the time that I should have been preparing, I ended up making an entire body of work in a month, which is a really, really fantastic exercise that I don't really ever want to do that again. But it was really great. I got to try out a lot of things quickly and find a lot of ideas that I wanted to keep exploring. And these are all pieces from that show. These are all still soft glass. With furnace glass, torch stuff, glass. And many of them incorporated elements made at the furnace. This is another piece from that show, sort of about the experience of being sick, which was a real turning point for me. It got me thinking about time and how it might be spent and how I want to use it. And this piece is called "Time is going to take so much away, but there's a way that you can offer time a trade," which is a lyric from a song that goes on, you got to do something that you can get better at, something that's going to take a lot of time. And I started seeing the practice of craft as being a lifelong endeavor, a buildup of time. Time is going to get you in the end, but the trade is that you can use that time to learn how to do something beautiful, which you really cannot achieve without the benefit of that buildup of time. And I started to think about craft and making things as being one of the most amazing and rewarding things that human beings can do with our time. And I also decided that I wanted to go to grad school and really pick these ideas apart, because grad school is the place to do that. So in the months before I started grad school, is that video playing? It is, sweet. In the months before I started grad school, I revisited some of the ideas from my box of optical devices, and I started making little private installations outdoors and making stop motion videos of the changing patterns and weather conditions. This one is this really itty bitty tiny little installation. The tallest thing is maybe 2 inches high. And this is another one that I did at a residency that I did at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts. Different Salem, as it turns out. And about a month before I started grad school, and I got very, very sunburned waiting for the tide to come in. And I think that I'm fond of stop motion videos because they show a visual representation of otherwise invisible time. You can kind of see things, you can see buildups of time. And I also just love the nature of movement in stop motion, things just kind of popping in and out of space, and movements that feel very mechanical and analog. This is a floating doily for decorating a corner of the ocean. And the little floats hold up a net of beads just below the surface of the water. So I did 3 years of grad school at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. And grad school is for making all the things, many things, even bad things, and weeding out the really lousy ideas and figuring out where the good ideas are likely to be hiding. And in my program, we spent the first semester making one piece per week, which really, really shakes the dust off. And few of them were really keepers, but many of them illuminated paths to follow. And I got to try out a lot of ideas. So this is a selection of things that I made.
To leave your body and leave it cold, to draw flesh.
that I made in grad school that I did consider that one worth saving, and also that one really illuminated some paths. So over my first winter break of grad school, I went to the Corning Museum of Glass in Corning, New York to take a class with Mike Evans, who's super awesome, who is here right now somewhere probably. And it was a really pivotal class for me. He demonstrated all sorts of things that were just like way, way over my understanding that I was not the least bit qualified to absorb at that moment, having never really touched boro before. But there were two of these just really minor technical demos that just absolutely clicked in my head and made me feel like I'd just received the keys to the kingdom. And this is a piece that I made in that class, and the inner part of this thing rotates a little bit and it kind of makes this squeaking noise, which is awesome. So this is the first real finished piece that I made in which I really managed to put together everything, all of those ideas that had come from the first semester of grad school, plus those technical keys to the kingdom in a neat and tidy way. And I finished out that second semester with pieces in the same vein. These were the first object-based pieces in which the photo documentation of the piece was almost more important than the piece itself, and I realized that I was kind of appearing as this character in the photos. Also lots of optical devices, because I'd wandered into researching the history of moving images, in which, as it turns out, optical devices figure pretty prominently. This is a pair of glasses. This is a lorgnette, another optical device. The summer after my first year of grad school, I got a scholarship to go over to Murano, Italy, Historical Center of Glassmaking, to study with master goblet maker Davide Fouin. And at this time I was still working in the hot shop, pretending that I wasn't flameworking, and trying to figure out how to just do stuff in the hot shop, because I really like being in the hot shop. And I just wasn't having very much success doing that. And in retrospect, that class was the catalyst that really made me give up the hot shop and seriously migrate over to the torch. And just something about the whole class. It was a wonderful, wonderful class, and I'm really glad I went and took it. But it absolutely made me feel like everything I'd learned up to that point in the hot shop had just been a big lie, a disaster of misunderstanding. And I felt like I'd become constrained by the rules in the hot shop and could no longer think outside the boundaries of chasing skill. And the pursuit of skill had come at the expense of ideas. And over on the torch, and this is still pretty true, I don't know the rules. There are fewer of them, and I don't care that much about following them. Whereas in the hot shop, I can get like pretty worked up about the angle at which someone is marvering. On the torch, like I have no idea what's going on over there. And it's way, way easier to make things that you can put on your head. This one is called Eulogy for Ornament, and it was a reaction to seeing Gothic architecture for the first time, having taken a side trip to Germany directly following the class on Murano. And man, Gothic architecture is so filled with ornament, and it's a pretty sparse contrast to the architecture that we see over here, where we do not have Gothic ornament. We don't have anything like that. I'm kind of annoyed about that. I wish that we had more of that over here, and that we hadn't settled into this idea of living in white boxes. Pretty stupid. This is a barn owl. This is a piece, I made this piece because I was thinking about a book by Barbara Kingsolver, and in her novel Prodigal Summer, there's a passage in which a city-born entomologist, somebody who studies insects, has fallen in love with and married a farmer from rural Virginia. And the couple finds it difficult to communicate from across the gap in their dissimilar upbringings. And in the passage, they have quarreled, and she is watching him from the house as he cuts flowers down in the field. And she has smelled the flowers before she sees him in the field, and knows immediately that he's bringing him to her as an apology because he doesn't have the words to speak an apology. And she, in her mind, equates this to the Luna moth, which as an adult creature has no mouth, so it can't eat, and it can only communicate with other moths with pheromone scents. This is still from a video, which is way too long to play here, in which I donned a glass seaweed parure, a set of earrings and necklace and tiara and stuff, and sang this traditional Appalachian ballad about a woman who dreams of her lover covered in seaweed and knows that from the seaweed in his hair that he's drowned at sea. This one is called Stone Blind Love. And this one is called Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie. This was the largest and by far the most foolish wearable piece I have made. This was just such a pain in the ass from start to finish. And now that I've made it, and now that it's in my life and I cannot get rid of it, it remains a pain in the ass, and there's no end in sight. I will never be rid of this thing. And I finished it during the summer between my second and third year of grad school, and promptly just decided I would never make anything like that ever again. It's too much. Which brings us right into my thesis show. And for my thesis work, I wanted to build on that great mess of ideas that came out of that progenitor of the modern museum, the Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities. And I wanted to create a body of works that could exist together as a collection and convey the power that objects have to collect histories. I wanted to delve into the histories of archaic and forgotten objects from an uncertain past. This is a collection of replicas of baby rattles, and these are replicas of objects that actually existed. And I think that they function as an excellent illumination of the idea that the past is a foreign country. These objects like this are very foreign to the modern imagination. Like, you would not give that to a baby. And things like that were given to babies, and that is mind-boggling. I made a whole room full of objects and groupings, approximately 90, 92, 95-ish. And the title of the collection was the Magpie Museum of Disorderly Inquiry. And the magpie seemed like a good organizing principle. Bottle caps collected alongside fine jewelry, an apparently random collection, except when seen from a particular point of view, the point of view of a magpie, both bottle caps and jewelry being equally as shiny and attractive to a bird. Each piece had a handwritten label which detailed its origins, title, or explanatory information. And the label on this one reads, "The volume of my mouth as measured in the marbles which seem to fill it when I try to speak to you." And each marble contains a letter spelling out the sentence, "I want to tell you." Everything was displayed on antique furniture so that when the viewer walked into the room, it was like stepping into an ornamentally cluttered parlor of artifacts. And a number of the objects were associated with short videos. So I made this little video viewing booth with tiny little velvet curtains and a tiny little screen in the back. This is one of the, there were lots of just really short little videos, some of them with sound, some of them without sound. This is an articulated whale. I figured that since the whole show was about looking carefully and stumbling upon stories, mere postcards would not do as invitations. So I designed these tiny, tiny little labels for tiny, tiny little bottles with tiny, tiny little messages inside, giving the details of the show, which I hid in more or less inconspicuous places around town. And one person actually did come to the show because she found a bottle. Possibly other people did too, but that one was worth it. And since all the stories of the objects were important and the connections between the stories were important, I also made a small booklet for visitors to the museum to peruse as they viewed the collection. And it had an index, and I don't know if you've ever tried to index anything, but it's pretty fascinating. And then when you're done with it, you're like, wow, that was quite a project. So I was really happy about the index. And the following are some of my standout favorites from the show. This is a model of a bee with wings that can move. It's about yay big. This is a skeletal hand with tiny flowers coming out of each joint. This one's called the Cape of the Selkie Bride, and it's constructed from chain links so that it moves like fabric. And it's kind of an uncanny object because you know it's made out of glass, but it sort of like flows, and it makes glass noises, you know? This is a pair of candlesticks with bird feet. This is a Charivari, or Bavarian woodsman's chain of hunting amulets. This is a comb. This one's called Time Past. This is a ghost turtle shell, a handkerchief, a snail on a tightrope. This one is called The Keys to the Kingdom. This is a languier, or table ornament, medieval table ornament to prevent deliberate and accidental poisoning. This is a glass drawing of a magpie. This one is called Miser's Purse, and I'm just going to read you the description that accompanied it. I am a miser of time. I hoard my time. I stash it away. I fight against forces which deprive me of it. I see the practice of learning skills as a way of collecting time. You put time in, years of time, and it builds up, forming this great pile of potential. Making things using that collected time/skill is another way of hoarding time. You put time in, that time forms an object. That object is a record of your collected time. Things that are intricate and clearly time-consuming appeal to me for this reason. Each tiny little piece was, for a moment, the entire focus of one person's attention. And when you look at that piece, you are seeing that intense buildup of collected attention. Generally, I think the practice of making things is a virtuous use of time. Human beings are stuck here in time, and I believe that making things is a way of working with time rather than fighting against it. Human beings have the potential to make beautiful things with time, but it has kind of a dark side too. When you're hoarding your time making things, you are not spending that time with loved ones or really in service to anyone but yourself. And so the term miser is pretty apt. And a miser's purse, which this object is a replica of, is a type of small satchel that was popular from the late 18th century up through the early 1920s. And it's two little pouches that are connected by this really narrow neck. And then there's a little slit in the neck so that it's really, really easy to just drop a coin into it. But then it's very, very difficult to ever remove that coin. So if you start stashing things in there, you're a real miser. This is a mourning necklace in imitation jet. This is an orrery, which is a word that I just cannot say. It's a model of the movement of planets. So the yellow orb is the sun, and it has a little candle inside. And then the Earth is on a little arm that can rotate around the sun. And the Earth, while it's rotating around the sun, can turn on its own little axis, and then the moon can orbit around the Earth, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. These are pie crimpers. A little circle of scarabs. This is a collection of archaic sewing implements. And this is a video that goes along with it.
1 for sadness, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, and 4 for a boy. 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never told.
This is an articulated snake, so he's kind of made out of chainmail. He's very flexible. A spider web, a fan, a replica of a Scottish snuff mull, a sycamore leaf. This is a time machine. 2 toads. An articulated model of a blackbird's wing that folds like a fan. And after the show closed, I was like done with my degree and everything. It was pretty exciting. So I packed up my whole studio and everything in the show and put everything in boxes in storage and set off on just the busiest couple of months that I've ever experienced, in which I flew across the ocean twice in one summer and across the country and back, and just made things in all sorts of places around the world. Crazy stuff. And this, I'm only mentioning it because this particular experience of traveling and teaching and making things was pretty interesting from the perspective of making things, because I was making things that I knew that I couldn't really keep because they were too fragile to take on an airplane. And it just gives you sort of an unfamiliar relationship with things when you know that you're just going to leave them in a foreign country. And that kind of, I guess, brings us up to the present moment, to this demo that I'm really dreading. But we'll get to that eventually. So in mid-September, I started a 3-year residency at Penland School of Crafts in North Carolina, where outdoors it looks like this. And then indoors, in my studio, it looks like this. And I make stuff in there, and I really like being in there, and it's my favorite place to be. And that's about all I have to say for right now, I think. Yeah, to be continued. Yeah. So it's kind of general organizing principle. I like doing stuff that involves bending curves on kiln shelf and then picking those curves up to form 3-dimensional objects. So I'm going to run through kind of a sampler of how I do processes involved in that kind of work. So I always start with a drawing, and this is my drawing for my object that I'm working on today. It's this bird cage right here, and secretly I did most of it at home, so you guys get to see just the exciting parts. So I try to figure out the solutions to any problems on paper before I start moving into any kind of object making. So I spend a lot of time drawing stuff out and figuring out how things are going to go together and working from scale drawings. So that's what this thing is up here. So I make my drawing, and then I get out carbon paper. Do you guys know about carbon paper? No, serious question. Not everybody knows about carbon paper. It's really good. It's good for transferring images, and it's good for transferring images to kiln shelf. So carbon paper. And I like to work on, when I do my drawings, I like to work on tracing vellum for a couple reasons. One, because it's really easy to lay out symmetrical objects, because you can make one half of the thing and then fold it and trace it and see how it's going to look. So that makes, I suppose you could do all of this on a computer really easily, but paper also works. And then it's also nice because if you're doing anything where layers are built up, so you're adding imagery to imagery in layers, it's much, much easier to register your drawings on the piece of kiln shelf. So like if I was not using a piece of paper that was transparent, I would have a really hard time lining up my images with each other and matching things up. So with transparent paper, super, super easy to do that. And especially if you're like tracing something out and you forget part of it, and then you have to go back and put that in the right spot, tracing paper. So I make my drawing on tracing paper, I transfer it to kiln shelf here, and you guys are welcome to come up later and check out this piece of kiln shelf. I have a kind of like a mental block against ever erasing anything on this piece of kiln shelf, so there's like a record of everything I've ever made on it, which is kind of cool, but also super confusing because it's all these like lines crossing over lines, and it's really hard to tell what's going on. But I don't know. Here, I'll clear this off so that the camera can see. If I turn this. Ooh. So that right there, can you see that right there? That thing right there is this thing right here. So all the information for putting this thing together is right there on that drawing. So once you transfer the drawing to the kiln shelf with carbon paper, the carbon paper isn't really, that line is not really strong enough to stand up to the heat of the flame. So you have to go over everything in pencil. And I like using a pencil with a metal tip to it, because a lot of times I'll get myself in a situation where I need to go back in and add a line or just reinforce a line. And if you're using a plastic pencil, you tend to just melt a lot of pencils. So it's just cheaper to have a metal pencil. You only go through one pencil. So let's see. So that's general overview. So colored glass really doesn't come in that many thicknesses, right? We can get like 7 millimeter, or we can get like, 4 maybe? Some companies make some 4 millimeter. Anyway, that's not good enough. So I spend a lot of time just pulling stringer. So I'm going to show you how I pull stringer. Just, I don't know, how to show you something. So, and I spend a ton of time pulling stringer of lots of different thicknesses. And it is kind of nicer to pull it yourself, because you can decide like, oh, I think I want this one little part to be 1.5 millimeters instead of, and you can do that if you want. And there are, of course, lots of different ways to pull. There's lots of different ways to do all sorts of things, and some of them work really well, and some of them don't. And do whatever gets you there. If it works, go for it. So I'm going to attach this here. Peacock Chameleon Glass Alchemy. Oh, you're welcome. And this one, it was probably a poor choice for this demo because it does this weird thing where it starts to like sort of bubble before it's hot, and you have to heat it up kind of more. I have to heat it up with this pulling stringers this way more than I would with other colors. Other colors, I can just get them hot and pull them. And this color, it seems like I have to spend a lot more time in the flame getting it really, really hot all the way through. So some colors, if you just go and just kind of gather them up, wad them up, and pull them, they'll get really, really lumpy when you pull them. So I pull stringer this way, heating up along the length of the rod instead of gathering it up, which is maybe not the most efficient way of doing it. So I'm going to get that hot and then pull that. And I usually heat up a longer length, but it's the longer length you choose to heat up, the more difficult it is to pull the stringer. And I know that since this is a demo situation, that I should just make it easy on myself. So I have my stringer there, and super important for this particular kiln shelf technique, I want to make sure that my stringer is of a uniform diameter. So if it has a really thick spot in it, so if I was to cut it off, like up in this thick spot over here, rather than just sticking with that uniform diameter, it'll start to kind of roll around on the kiln shelf, and it'll make for a less accurate bend. So I'm going to cut that off in what looks like a wasteful fashion. And I'm doing that just so I have the same diameter all the way around. I do it. And same deal on the other end. So there's step one, stringers. Stringers and stringers and stringers, and just like so many stringers. And this is, I'm going to show you this because I think it's a little bit funny. Time management and like preparation and stuff, not strong point or whatever. So I became convinced that I was going to run out of color before finishing all this. So I was welding all my little ends back together, but I didn't run out of color. It was okay, but I thought it was funny. So let me get out my little mini torch here. So now that I have my stringers, now I can come over to my drawing and I can start bending stuff. And the little mini torch, I don't know how familiar everybody is with these thingies, but these thingies are awesome. This is like the best tool I've ever bought. And for whatever reason, I don't know why I bought it because I thought it was cute, but I didn't have a particular use for it. And then it just sat for a year or something, and I didn't touch it. And then I just weep for lost time because it's the best thing in the world. And I use this is a Smith little torch, and I'm using a number 7 tip on here. The Smith comes with like a 7 through 3 or something like that. And those really teeny little tips, the 3 is very nearly unlightable with oxygen and propane. I think it's more for jewelry stuff. But like the 4, 5, 6, and 7 are super useful. I'm using the 7 right now just because it has a pretty good range to it. So I can get like a comparatively giant flame. I mean, for tiny flames, that's a pretty giant flame. Or I can get a super tiny flame. Like that's super itty bitty. And then the smaller tips, you can get even itty bittier than that and slightly different flame characteristics. Anyway, so this thing's super awesome. And then this thing also, this is the Smith little stand. And this is super great because you can use it as a hand torch and do like bendy stuff or like flamey stuff. But then you can also use it as the tiniest bench torch in the world for making incredibly tiny stuff. So I'm going to show you here, I'm going to do a little quick demo about bending stuff on a kiln shelf. And it's one of those things that it's pretty anticlimactic. This is when I mentioned that what I do is even more boring than regular flame working. This is what I'm talking about. This is the boring part. So I'm going to work on right in here. Oh wait, I didn't even tell you what I was doing up here. I just showed you this bird cage and then started talking. So there's this bird cage thing here, and then there's this wad of tiny things. And these tiny things are going to go in this bird cage. But first, I'm going to build a tiny bird cage on top of this bird cage, just so you can see that process and speed it up a little bit, because something this size is a little bit slower, whereas like the thing that's going to go on top of here is only this big, so it will be much, much faster. And then so that little thing is going to sit on this little thing is going to go here, and then the whole thing's going to be a thing. So to start bending things on a kiln shelf, I'm going to start with a little elbow, a little right angle bend of glass that's approximately the same diameter of the glass I want to bend. So I want to size the size of my elbow. I want to match the size of my elbow to the size of the glass that I'm bending. So and the reason I want to use a little elbow is because I'm going to weigh this down. This is going to be the spot that I connect to so that my glass isn't just wobbling all over the table. So I'm going to weigh this down, and it's much, much easier to weigh down a right angle thing than it is to just weigh down a little piece of rod, right? Because if you weigh down this little piece of rod, it's going to roll around a lot and it's going to shift, and the elbow doesn't shift quite as much. So I'm starting with an elbow, and I'm going to set that up at the end of my drawing. So at some point where a line segment stops. So I'm going to get that set up on here. And I have this little bend laid out here. It looks like this, the bend that I'm trying to bend. So I'm going to get that laid out. And make sure it's pretty accurate on there. And then I'm going to use my little piece of stringer that I just pulled. And I want to tidy up that end of it so that I can make a nice weld later. And then I'm going to just make a little cold seal here. Actually, a pretty egregious cold seal. This thing is gonna break, and that's the whole point. That's what I want to happen. And I would prefer that it not break like before I'm done bending it, but whatever. If that happens, it happens. So little cold seal there to the end of that little elbow. And then I also have my piece of kiln shelf. I have it on a Lazy Susan. I have it on a banding wheel. So it spins really, really easily so that I can get to, if I'm making complicated curves, I can just shift this thing around instead of walking around the table, which makes things a lot easier. Whoops. So I'm going to get that cold sealed up there again. And then I'm just going to start to heat up the length of that rod. And when I'm heating up glass on the kiln shelf, this is key bit of information. If you go straight down on that with your torch, you're almost always going to stick your glass directly to the kiln shelf. And you can't really fix that. Once that's happened, you're just going to have to throw it away. There's no coming back. So to avoid that, all you got to do is, instead of coming from this angle, come from this angle so that you're heating along the surface rather than straight down on the surface, and that'll keep things from sticking. And also, quick side note, this is a bare piece of kiln shelf, which works a whole hell of a lot better than kiln shelf with kiln wash on it, because kiln wash is really, really, really dusty, and so when you go to transfer drawings onto it, you end up just transferring dust onto your graphite paper, which is very frustrating. And bare kiln shelf also is not, when you kiln wash kiln shelf, the kiln wash tends to stick to your glass. And if you're careful with bare kiln shelf, it won't stick nearly as much as kiln washed glass or kiln washed shelf. So and of course, because I'm talking a lot, my cold seal is coming off. So I'm heating along the length of my stringer. And with my right hand over here, I'm kind of constantly putting a little bit of pressure on it so that I can see whether it's moving and how much it's moving. So I'm heating along the length. And I'm not just staying in one spot, I'm moving. And I got to the point that I need that bend to go to, and then I'm going to cut that off. So I turned down my flame. I had a pretty broad flame going comparatively for a tiny torch. That was a pretty broad, fluffy flame. So I'm going to turn it down to a tiny little pointy flame, and then cut that off right on my line there. And tidy that up for the next bend. And then I'm going to throw a little bit of heat on there just to make that cold seal crack better, and then snap that right off so that I have this nice little bend. You see that? Which is not super exciting, but if you make like 20 of these, all of a sudden you can make an object. And you can also do much, much, much more complicated bends this exact same way. So I brought some little things that I've made, and this is just made in exactly the same way that I just showed you, just with tinier stringer and more complicated bends. Yeah. And you're welcome to come up here and look at these things. So, let's see, where were we? I have this whole pile of tiny little stuff here. So in preparation for this, I made all of my little bends in advance. Oh, I wonder which one is the hot one right now. That'd be really good information. It's not terribly hot. That's another nice thing about working with stuff that's this tiny is it doesn't stay hot for very long. You don't have to have a lot of patience. So I'm going to construct a little model of this same birdcage, but smaller, on top of this birdcage. And I'm going to do it the same exact way that I put this bigger thing together. I'm going to weigh it down a little bit, because sometimes it's really frustrating to be trying to work on things when they're falling all over the place. And these are just something I dragged out of a scrap bin, but they happen to be the exact perfect tool for this job. I believe that they are made out of tool steel, because they're super heavy. They're heavier than mild steel, and they're also super flat, which makes them work better for holding stuff down, and they have holes in them, which makes it easier to pick them up when they're really hot. So I'm going to weigh this down. Oh wait, no, I have one more step to do before this. Sorry, back up. So I have, I think, how many little spokes? 8 little spokes. And if I want those all to come together, that's going to make this a really unpleasant joint that's going to want to crack, because it's going to be kind of a mass of glass, and that's going to pull on these little sticks. And so it'll almost certainly crack at these little sticks. Not like absolutely it will, but it's likely that it will. And so I would prefer to reduce that likelihood. So instead of doing that, I'm going to have all these little spokes come together in a little ring. Like this ring, but much, much smaller, because this is a smaller birdcage. So I'm going to make that little ring first. So I have my little ring laid out here, and this is a slightly more convoluted process because this is a closed shape instead of an open form or a line. So I'm going to cold seal to sort of the side of my circle and then bend around the circle and then break it off from the cold seal. I'm going to start out with a tidy end here. So I want the spot where this circle joins, where the two ends of the circle joins, I want that to be as invisible as possible, and a good way of making that happen is to start with nice tidy little ends of a rod. So I don't want to start with a cylinder with a ball at the end. That's going to make for a pretty ugly weld. And I also don't want to start with a cylinder with a cone at the end. That's going to also make for an ugly weld. So I have a cylinder with like a half sphere at the end. Cylinder, straight sides, sphere. And this I tend to be a little bit of an untidy table person. I cannot keep it tidy, but this process really forces you to keep your workspace clear because this stick is kind of swinging around in this whole area, so that whole area has to be clear for this to work. So I'm going to cold seal the side of this rod to my little elbow there. And then I'm going to kind of bend both sides at the same time. So I've got my tweezers in my right hand and the torch in my left hand, but I have this hand kind of free enough that I can push with these fingers. So I'm going to heat up that spot near that cold seal. I'm going to do this part first so that I don't have to come back and mess with that cold seal. Because if I mess with that cold seal, it's going to break, and then I'm going to have to repunty it. So I did that first initial bend, and then I'm going to finish up this short side. And then I'm going to switch over and do this longer side. And once I was done bending that part by that cold seal, I'm going to try to stay away from that and not really come back to it until I need to break it off. And the broader, like a very broad, subtle bend is much, much harder to make look nice than a really tight bend. So if you're just starting out, the more things that you can lay out with like tiny, tiny little tight bends, the easier it will be, the nicer things will look.
Do you mind questions while you're...
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah, questions are totally fine.
Do you ever use jigs, or do you always bend freehand?
So the question was, do you ever use jigs, or do you always bend freehand? And I pretty much bend freehand because having a drawing on there is almost like working with a jig. I can really see what's going on and bend really accurately. And it's also nice because I don't have to have a jig made for every single thing I want to do. I just make a drawing, and that's my jig. So I'm going to get to the end of the circle here where I want to join this thing. And I'm going to cut it off a little bit short because it's much, much easier to fill a gap than it is to have excess glass that's squished up against glass. And again, I'm going to make sure that that end is nice and tidy. So cylinder with a little half circle at the top, at the end. And bend those in closer. And then I'm just going to stitch those two little ends together. So I'm not going to get either end very hot, but I am going to get this little piece of filler rod really hot, and I'm just going to fill that gap. So I'm going to touch down on one side, touch down on the other side, and then pull up in the middle. Touch down, and then pull up. And then the cool thing about working this way is that you can really drag glass around with this little flame. So glass will go toward the flame. So you can heat it up and pull it with the flame. So this looks terrible right now. This is a mess. And all I have to do to fix that is just heat it up and drag that glass where I want it to go. Yeah, so there was a little gap, and I filled that with the filler rod. So I'm going to heat it up from the outside and pull that filled glass toward the outside, and then heat it up from the inside a little bit and pull it from that direction. And I'm going to add just a tiny bit more filler rod because there's a little waistline in there right now, and I don't really like how that looks. So add a little bit more and then drag it around with the flame. And you can make things look pretty tidy this way. It's not ever going to be completely invisible, that join, but it's very nearly invisible, and then it's super easy to hide if you're adding it to something else. So if I'm gonna just be putting little spokes on that, so where that join is, I can just put a little spoke there, and it will be totally invisible. I'm gonna break this off from here. I'm gonna give it a little bit of heat, and then snap it free. And then pretty much everything, when you're doing stuff like this, you need to heat it up. Because I don't want this to stick to the kiln shelf, I don't want to go straight down on it. So I'm not putting in quite enough heat in it to get a hot seal all the way through that rod. So pretty much everything I need to flip over. Now I forgot which side was which. Flip over and then weld the other side. And it's usually very little heat. It takes very little heat to make that joint look nice. So now I have my little ring. This is my little ring for the top of my little bird cage that's going to go on top of the big bird cage. So I'm going to set this up and weigh that down. So I want to make this easy on myself. So I want to start with 2 points that are in, or 2 lines that are in a plane, because it's going to be much easier to match up all those other lines to look proper, rather than trying to freehand it and like trying to make sure that they're in the same plane. That's really hard. So the first set of lines that I bent, I did the entire bend of the shape. So both sides of it, it's a symmetrical object, so both sides of the symmetrical object. And then I left a little piece of clear in there, just kind of to hold it together, but also as a marker. So I'm going to remove that clear once I get it onto this thing. And pretty much everything that I make this way, sort of like proto-bridging almost. I'm making self-bridging objects that are held down in 2 places. So I'm going to tack this, and then weld this. And that makes it so that I can do those welds, and this thing isn't going to go anywhere because it's held down in this other spot over here. So pretty much everything all of these things that are put on this object were done in like a tack, weld strategy. 2 points, stick them down, make sure they're in the right spot, and then weld one. The other one's holding that one up, and then weld the other one, etc. Does that make sense? So I wanted to set myself up like that from the beginning. So I have this hoop. I have 2 ends. Both those ends are going to touch down. So I'm just going to tack this in place, because I know that I'm not going to put it where I actually want it to go on the first shot. It's really unlikely that that's going to happen. So I want to just be able to break that free if I need to. So I'm going to tack that. Tack it over here on one side. Totally missed. Okay. So that's in the spot where I want it to be, but it's not necessarily at the angle that I want it to be. So I have tiny little machinist squares, and I'm going to use that to make sure that it is actually square. And I can see just by looking at it that it's really, really not square. So first I'm going to do it by eye first. And then when I get closer, I'll do it with the machinist square. So it's tacked in place right now, which means it doesn't take a whole lot of heat to get it to move around. So I have a lot of leeway to get it where I need it to be. And I'm going to see whether it's square. When you're trying to see whether something is square, you want to get it from as many angles as possible. So I'm not just going to be like, oh yeah, totally square. Instead, I'm going to go like that. Actually, I can't do it from there because I don't have a flat surface. But at the very least, I'm going to come over here, make sure it's square-ish from that, and then from the other side too. Pretty square. Yup, square. So I've got it tacked in that one spot. I'm going to add a little stitch here to tack it down in this spot over on this side. So tack, tack, and now I'm going to weld. And just like doing this flat on the kiln shelf, once I get that glass hot, I can just drag it with the flame. So I'm pulling it, using the flame to pull it into that joint. And I want to make sure that I get that joint from all angles. Just getting it from one side is going to leave you with a little acute angle in the other side, and it will certainly crack from there. It is very predictable. So that's nice and welded in, and then I'm gonna stop for a second. I'm gonna let that cool, because if I go over here and start heating up that other side, while that's still hot, the whole thing's gonna fall over, which is very shocking when it happens. I mean, shocking to me. So now that's cool, I can go over here and weld in that other side. And I only want to put in as much heat as I need to fix up that weld. So if I stay on there for a long time, that joint is going to start to distort. It's going to get really ugly. So as soon as I see those two sides just run together, I'm going to get out of there with my torch. So that's nice and welded together. So now, because I have that, because those two were attached and they had been flat on a plane, I know that they're in the same plane. I don't have to do any shifting and guessing. So now I'm going to get this piece of clear out of here because I don't really need that. That was just a temporary measure. Get that out of the way. And then get that out of the way. Oops. So now I have room in there for my little ring that I bent. So I can put that little ring in there and then add the rest of the spokes to that ring. And same deal with this ring. This is another tack, tack, weld, weld situation. I'm going to tack it on one side, tack it on the other side, and then weld each side. It's also another way of making nice little joints this way is to just match the size of your flame to the size of the thing that you're trying to work on. So these are tiny, tiny little things that I'm working with. So a large-ish flame like that is inappropriate for this situation. And I'm going to heat up the end of the rod that I want to stick this to so that I don't distort my little circle. So I've got my circle pretty close up there, so it's close enough to be getting warm, but I'm not actually putting heat into it because I don't want to mess it up. So again, I'm almost certain when I'm doing this that I'm going to put it in kind of the wrong spot. So I'm going to tack it and then fix it. And then I want that level, and I want it level by eye, but I also have a tiny little level that I can use to level it. I'm not going to worry about it too much because visually it'll look okay, but like on this bigger one where you can see stuff better, I did use this tiny little level to make sure that it really was level on there. I'm going to try to make it a little bit more level. All right, so it's tacked. I'm going to tack the other side. And then weld. And this one on this side, I can see that there's not quite enough glass there. I can see a little bit of a waistline already before I even start welding it in. So I'm just going to add a little bit to fill that in. So that's nice and filled in. Get it from the other side. So now all I have to do is put my little spokes on. And one thing I like about building things this way is that you can just hold things in your bare hands and put them together. Maybe not with like tiny, tiny stuff like this, but with the rest of the spokes for this bird cage, I just held them in my hand and put them on. And there's no like problem of like, how am I going to hold on to this thing? Should I punt it or like hold it with grabbers or something? It's hot. It's really hard to hang on to. No, you just hold it in your hand. So let's see. I think there's 8 of these. So I'm going to match this up to this. And again, since this thing is so tiny, I'm just going to kind of do this stuff by eye. But with bigger stuff, I would have all the I would mark it out where everything needs to go. And I would have that marked on the glass before I start trying to put it together. With permanent marker, which doesn't seem like it would work, but it does. It kind of burns away for a second, and then this little ghost image of it appears for a second, and that's enough time for you to be able to see what's going on and get everything in place. And sometimes if it's like a situation where I'm going to be putting a lot of heat into it for a while, and I know that that permanent marker is going to burn off, I'll put like a little dot of glass on it so that I can still see, like while I can see the permanent marker, I'll put a dot over that, and that gives me a little bit of a better marker in some situations. And then another one here. And if this was bigger, and if I was like doing it for real instead of a demo, I would use my little squares to square everything up. But I'm not going to worry too much about this thing. We don't want to be here all day worrying about whether things are square, or I don't. And again, when I'm tacking these things together, it's a mess. That little blob of glass that I put on there, it does not look pretty, but it is really easy to fix and make it look nice. Let's see. The question was, does the same technique work on larger rods? And yeah, up to like, I mean, I don't mess around with anything much larger than 6 millimeter rods. Stuff starts to crack more once you get up into like 6 and 7, and you would have to do more stuff of like putting things together hot and doing stuff in kilns. So up to about 6, I mean, you can still like bend parts of things, 7 millimeter rod and larger, but it becomes more difficult to put them together. So like for some pieces I've made like 7 millimeter circles, and that works totally fine. But then when you try to stick that to something, you tend to have more joints cracking. You have fewer joints cracking with smaller rods. Okay, I'm gonna put 4 more of these on here just for the purposes of finishing this object. And then I'm gonna talk about bridging a little bit, because I think it's the second coolest thing in the world after this tiny torch. And this is a comparatively simple object, right? These are really, really simple curves. And the way that this object is made three-dimensional is just by putting together these curves in a symmetrical manner. But you can get super non-symmetrical this way. As long as you know where things go and you have 2 points of contact, you can stick things together. You can build up three-dimensional volumes very, very easily. When I do more complicated shapes, so more organic shapes, less geometric shapes, a lot of times I'll build a model in armature wire first. You guys know about armature wire? It's aluminum wire. It's about 3 millimeter, or you can get it in about 3 millimeter diameter. And it's super, super bendy, but it's also fairly structurally sound. And I think people use it for like the inner structures of clay sculptures and wax sculptures. But you can bend it. It's soft enough that you can like actually bend it to the curves of your face or something and get pretty accurate things. And as long as you keep it in a plane, you can then take that wire curve and trace it directly onto the kiln shelf, which is a really nice way of building things. 2 more after this one. And it is super important when you're doing joints like this, it is super important that that be a hot seal, a nice smooth curve all the way through, and you can see it happen. You'll see like the 2 separate pieces of glass, and you'll see them heat up, and you'll see orange on both these sides with this dark little groove in the middle. And then as soon as you see that dark little groove become the same color orange as those 2 sides, you know you have a nice weld.
How do you fix it if you overwork it?
Take it off and do it again. Don't overwork it. Just do it right the first time. It's sadly, I feel like in glass, there's a whole hell of a lot of situations where the answer is like, just do it right the first time. Sadly. And it takes a while, and then the way to do it right the first time is to mess it up the first 100 times, and then the 101st time, you will do it right the first time. But that's like really hard to stomach when you're starting out. That's a terrible answer to give somebody. Sometimes this banding wheel, this is like a really nice banding wheel, and sometimes it works a little bit too well. And in that situation, this thing was moving while I was trying to stick it together. And these little tiny ones, I don't have to worry so much about it moving if both joints are hot, just because it doesn't have very much weight to it. So it's not trying to fall. Gravity is not acting very strongly upon it. And then one last little hoop here. And then we can go on to even more boring things.
Doing a wonderful job.
And sometimes I will get myself into a situation where, for whatever reason, that curve that I bent, it's a little short for whatever reason. So like maybe something shifted and I kind of lost track of where that line was. And so I actually, if I touch this end down to my little ring up there, it's going to mess up the curve because it's a little bit short in some dimension. Which is totally fixable. So all I have to do is fill that gap. So I'm just going to make a bigger stitch to hold those together. And again, that's super ugly, but all I have to do is pull that glass around with my torch, and that'll smooth out that curve. And it does become a little bit difficult at times to, like if you're making something that has a lot of tight curves to it, sometimes it gets really hard to get in there and get on the other side of a weld. So you have to get it from both surfaces. You can't just get it from one surface. So that's another reason why it's really nice to do things cold like this, so everything's bench cooled. If I needed to, I could just pick this thing up and hold it up and get to any surface that I want to get to. Now I forgot what weld I was working on. Yes. And I'm also kind of using the torch sort of as a flashlight. So I can't, a lot of times it's very, very difficult to see that joint until you hit it with the torch. So you don't know that you have a cold seal going until you hit it with the torch. So I'm also, as well as using the torch to heat the glass, I'm also using the torch to be able to see the glass. So now I have all my welds on there. I have my tiny bird cage on top of my slightly less tiny bird cage. So there's that. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got to this thing, this little pile of flowers and creatures, etc. lots and lots of things that I do it with bridging, which means sticking something on and then putting up a little scaffolding to hold it in place while I weld it. And have several different strategies for doing that. So I have a little stick here that I made, and I'm going to show you how I put tiny, tiny little flowers onto tiny, tiny little sticks. Because I spend a lot of time putting tiny, tiny little things onto tiny, tiny little sticks. So there's a couple different bridging strategies, and this is a strategy that I use for things that are more linear. So if something is longer than it is wide and has like branches sticking off of it or leaves sticking off of it or limbs or something, this is the bridging strategy that I would use. I'm going to come over here. So I have this stick, right? And I know that if I want to stick the tiny little flower to it, I know if I heat it up well enough to make a good weld, this stick is going to fall right over, right? It'll get hot, it'll get squishy, and it'll fall over. That's what glass does. So to prevent that, I'm going to put it on a little temporary bridging stick. So I'm going to make a hot seal on here. And I want this to be a hot seal because this is holding everything up. And if this seal fails, everything fails. Just failure all around. So I have that approximately where I want it to be, but right, if I heat up anything on here, it's going to fall over. So I'm going to hold this in place with a little piece of scaffolding so that I can work on it. And again, this is one of those situations where you want to match the size of the thing that you're trying to do to the size of your flame and to the size of the diameter of glass that you're working with. So I wouldn't bridge this with like 7 diameter. That makes no sense at all. I'm going to use 3 millimeter because it's a more appropriate size. And then I'm going to bend this around and stick that to the top of the stick to hold that in place, and then melt that off of there. So the key point of this, it's a little bit easier with larger diameter rods, but the key point is that I can heat up just the side of this rod without it falling over. So I made a nice hot seal here, made that little elbow sticking off, and now this thing can't go anywhere. So now I'm free to just put stuff all over this thing, which is exactly what I want to do. So I have a tiny, tiny little flower. And I make these tiny little flowers in a very soft glass-y kind of a way. So I make a little mass, I put tiny little bits on it, and then I squish those little bits to make petals. And I really like doing it on this tiny little torch, but you can totally do it on a full-size Carlisle. It works just as well. So I'm going to stick this flower on here. And this is going to be a cold seal, a fairly offensive cold seal. But that's fine, because I know I'm going to go back in and fix it later. This is just temporary. This is just tacking it in place. So I put that where I think it needs to go, and then I'm going to make sure that it actually is where it needs to go. So tack it on, looking at it from one direction, and then I'm going to look at it from other directions and decide that it is or is not in the right place. And it is in the right place. And then I'm going to bridge this over to my little bridging elbow here. So I'm going to touch down this 3 millimeter rod. And this thing's cold, right? I was just holding this in my hands. And it has like a lot of things going on there. So if I heat it up in the part of it where all the petals are attached and where all the inner parts of the flower are attached, it's going to blow up. So what I want to do is be careful and not heat it up in those parts. So I'm only heating it up on the very end of the stem and on the very points of the flower. And that's how I'm able to get away with that. Wait, I need a much, much smaller flame. There we go. So attaching that to just the very point of that flower, and then heating up that rod, bending it around and sticking it to this bridging stick. So now that thing is held in place. That thing cannot go anywhere, which means that I'm free to fix up that weld now and make it look super awesome. And this is just a really nice way of putting things together because there's a lot of certainty. All of your eggs are never in one basket. Everything builds up really, really, really slowly. You always have a chance to fix it. So that's how this is. I'll do one more so that you can, oh, here, I'll put this bird on here. So I have this tiny little bird. I can't even like hold it so that you can see it. It's so little. So tiny little bird. And I've made this bird so that it is a self-bridging object. So it's a thing that touches down in two places so that I can tack weld it onto a thing. So I'm going to put it on this little branch here. And before I do that, I'm going to bridge that branch over to my little bridging elbow. And one cool thing about glass is that it's really, really, really strong. So on tiny stuff like this, I can make really tiny little bridges, and that's plenty of mass to hold things up. They're almost just like these tiny little stringers of glass. So I don't want that branch wandering around while I'm trying to put that bird on it. So it is now bridged in place, can't go anywhere. And I'm gonna make a really, 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 really tiny flame here. So again, the bird, just like the little flower, if I go shooting flame into the mass of that bird, of course that bird is gonna blow up. It's glass, it blows up when you heat it suddenly. But if I only heat him up on his tiny little feet that are pretty far out away from the mass of the body, I can really stick him on there and make sure he's in the right spot and not heat it up so much that it's gonna explode. And also, so because I bench cooled it and it's cold, I can hold it in my hand to do this operation, which makes it a lot easier. Yeah, so the question was, did I make him with extra long legs? Yes, I cheated. I made him with extra long legs. So I'm gonna stick one foot on first. And I know that this is a particularly non-sticky color, so I'm going to stick both legs, attempt to stick both legs on. And those two joints are close enough together that it's pretty easy to heat up both of them at the same time so that I can shift him. So I didn't just tack him in one spot and shift him, I tacked him in both spots, and then I can move him around. And I think I want him facing moved slightly to the side. So I'm going to heat up both of those joints and then shift him a little bit so that he looks a little less silly. So he's tacked on there, tack one leg, tack another leg, and then I'm going to weld both of those joints. So there's one. And then I'm going to let that cool off a little bit so that he doesn't go flapping around because both joints are hot. And then I'll get back in there and fix up that other joint. And I'm putting more heat into the thing that I'm attaching the leg to because that's going to distort that tiny little leg less. If I put a lot of heat into that tiny little stick, it's going to start to change shape a lot. So if I concentrate the heat into the mass that it's going onto, that's going to keep that leg more of the shape that I want it to be. So now there's a tiny little bird on a tiny little stick. Yeah. So that's one strategy for bridging things that are longer than they are wide, things that are branch-like, things that have limbs. Another strategy for bridging things is if you have a mass where you can heat up one side of it and it's not going to cause the whole mass to move around. So that's more of a strategy that I would employ on like a larger flower like that. Larger. It's like the size of my thumb. Much, much larger. And that's a mass with stuff stuck on it. So I can heat up one side of that mass and the rest of it's going to stay stable. So I don't need it held down in two spots in the same way that I need a stick held down in two spots. So I'm going to show you that real quick. I have a nice rubber mat at home that I stand on. So I'm going to make a little mass here that I'm going to stick petals to. Get out of the way. I'm going to make a little mass and stick it onto a stick. And I want to leave space for myself to remove it from the stick later. So I'm going to ball this up a little bit. And I want enough real estate on this little mass so that there's room for all the things I want to stick on it. So I want enough area. And I know I have 5 little petals. So I want to make sure I have room for all 5 of them. So I've got a little mass going there. Punty that up very briefly. Stretch it out. Give it a little stem so that it's not going to be a real project to get it off from the stick later. I could just leave it. Look, I could just leave it on this stick, but instead I'm going to stick it on this other stick. Just so you get the idea that this stick is not involved in this object at all. And I want to make sure that this is a hot seal because this is holding everything up. And again, if that fails, everything fails. Crack that off. So I'm going to do the little inner part of the flower first. Put on these other glasses because I can't see anything. I'm going to do 6 little dots in the center of it, 1 in the middle, and then 5 are on the outside. So I have 6 little dots on there. And then I'm going to switch over to my tiny torch. And for bridging tiny stuff like this, I used to start out by pulling bridge material separately, so like pulling tiny little stringers to bridge with. But now I just use 3mm rod and just stretch out tiny little bridges. So I know I can heat up this mass on just one side and it's not going to flop all over the place. So I've got this tiny little petal in my tweezers here. I'm going to get that hot and tack it down to this little flower and then make sure that it's approximately in the right spot. And then once it's approximately in the right spot, I'm going to make sure it's exactly in the right spot. There we go. So the first 2 are often kind of squirrely or require you to be a little bit more efficient with your time because that is a cold seal right now, and that means that it has a lifespan. So once I put a cold seal on something, I know that I need to do something about it pretty quickly. So first 2, I'm going to bridge them to each other, so I have to be a little bit quick about it. So I'm going to stick that bridge on and then bend it around and stick it to that second petal. And I want that bridge to be coming off that petal this way, so parallel rather than perpendicular, because it's a lot easier to remove it if it's parallel. It's much easier to pull off. If it's perpendicular, it tends to get to be kind of a mess in there. So now those are stuck on there, they're tacked on there, they're bridged on there, and now all I have to do is fix up those welds. And I think a lot of people don't do stuff like this, like avoid bridging because it seems like a lot of extra time spent doing other things. But it's pretty fast. If you're not talking about it a whole lot in a demo situation, it's pretty fast. So 1 is on there and welded in. And I make sure this next one is welded in nicely. And again, I'm getting it from both sides. You cannot get away with only welding it from one side, which means that you have to set yourself up so that you can get to both sides. So I couldn't put that super close and make a joint that I couldn't reach from the other side. So now that I have the first two on there, the last three are pretty fast. Stick that on there, make sure it's in the right spot, and then bridge it. And when I'm stretching out those little bridges, I'm heating into the shoulder of the rod. So I'm not heating that thin spot at all. And then making sure that weld is good. And just kind of chasing that heat along the joint. And then two more little petals. And then melt that in.
Why is your work monochromatic?
I suppose because I just happen to be a little bit more interested in the shape of things than the color of things. I have no good answer for you on that.
Do you anneal it when you're done?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I bench cool as much as possible as I'm going through the process, but it absolutely needs to be annealed. So when I'm building structures, I'll work on the structure all day long, stick it in the kiln overnight, take it back out, work on it. If I don't do that, structures will just start to come apart.
Yeah.
So like on that big like peacock headdress thing that I was showing you guys, that thing was too big to fit in a kiln, and so I was not able to anneal it every night. And it got to a point where just chunks of it were shooting off of the piece, like with great force. Wow. And so I had to go find somebody with a kiln big enough to put it in and anneal it as many times as I could before I could even work on it anymore.
All right.
That was yet another reason why that piece was a disaster. So now it's a thing. But it's a thing with sticks stuck all over it, tiny little bridges. So let's get those out of the way. Nobody wants those. So the first thing when I go to start breaking bridges, or when I go to start removing bridges, the first thing I'm going to do is break the bridges. So break that connection point, because it's really easy to break that connection point out here where there's nothing really going on. It's kind of hard to get in here and mess around with the spot where it's attached to the thing that you want to keep. So I'm going to break it out here first. Super messy. Does not have to be tidy. And with teeny enough bridges, you can just heat them up and they'll melt away. That's another reason why I like using really, really tiny bridges. So now all those connections are broken. So now I can get in there and start to remove those from the thing itself. And I'm going to heat into the color, because I don't want to leave any clear on there. So I heat it into the color. I'm going to use that bridge as a handle for the next bridge. Heat into the color, pull that out of the way, handle for the next bridge. Same deal. Same deal. And a lot of times I suggest to students that they use a rod to do this with, because if you don't have a lot of hand control, this is a really good way to just melt the bejesus out of your tweezers. So you can also use just a trash rod to get those out of the way. So now it's a flower without stuff stuck all over it, which is way, way better. So that's all the technology that went into making all the things on here, right? So that's what I just showed you is exactly how I put this thing together. I just did it for longer and put more things on it.
How many hours do you have in that?
We should not talk about how many hours I have in this. It's like, I think I have about 2 days, 2.5 days. I always tell myself that it's going to take approximately a quarter of the time that it actually takes, which is why the 2 days is particularly galling. So now I'm going to get around to actually putting this thing in this thing. And I needed a spot to actually hold this, to a point to connect it. So I made this little part. This is going to be the bottom of the bird cage. And that's also going to support this mass of flowers. So I'm going to get this stuck on here first, and then once this is one unit, I'm just going to stick that in here and weld all these little sticks to all those little spokes. So I'm going to start by sticking this to this, and then this little thing is going to have little roots on it that are going to support the weight of it and make more attachment points on the base. So, and again, I'm just going to tack this in place and then take a second to make sure it's actually where I want it to be. So that's tacked in place. And I'm going to look at it from as many angles as possible so that I can really see whether it's straight. If you look at something from just one angle, you are not going to see whether it's straight. You will think that you are seeing whether it's straight, but you will be mistaken. And I also want to make sure that it fits in the birdcage at the particular angle that I've chosen to put it on the stand. And that looks like it fits well enough. So that's tacked in place right now. That is not a permanent fixture. And it's also only tacked in one spot. So if I heat that up to weld that, that whole thing's going to fall over. So I'm going to put a little arm on there, which is going to hold it up so that I can fix welds. And it's also just going to provide me more stability in the finished piece. And again, I'm going to stay away from any spots where anything exciting is happening. So if there's like a lot of stuff stuck to a thing, I don't want to be putting flame in that area. So I left myself space on the base of this tree thing so that I can put heat in there and stay away from anything complicated that's happening. And I'm going to put a couple little roots on this tree thingy. So I have just provided myself with 2 connection points instead of 1 connection point. So now I can get back in there and fix all those welds and nothing's going to fall over. And that trunk of the tree is pretty thick comparatively. pretty thick compared to the other things that it's attached to. So it takes quite a bit of heat to make a nice weld on there. And I want to make absolutely certain that I get it from all angles, because if I leave any little acute angles in there, it's going to crack for sure. So I've got one little root on there. I'm going to put 3 more on, just so it has, oh, I think I forgot a weld there. Totally forgot a weld. I'm going to put 3 more little roots on, just because this thing, it looks pretty light, it looks pretty small, but it's actually pretty heavy. And so I don't want it supported by just one or, ooh, whoops. So what I forgot was that it's one stick. And I started heating it up into the 1 stick area. So I'll just turn down my flame. I was just trying to get this tiny little weld, and I was a little bit just overly aggressive. It's a little giant flame. So I'm going to put a couple more little roots on there to hold it up. So now that's on that little stand. It's stable on there. And I don't have to touch anything near that tree ever again. So now all of the attachments have been, now I only have to deal with those far, far away from that little tree. So now I can just put the bird cage over that and position it where I need it to go. And for whatever reason, it only fits in one orientation. So I was just fiddling with it to make sure that it was in the right orientation. And there's big gaps, not big, but like millimeter gaps between all the spots where the spokes touch the cage. So all I'm going to do is just go around and fill those gaps. And since everything is supported everywhere, nothing is going to fall over. And I know that I can only get at these joints. I know that I need to get at them from all angles. And in this orientation, I can only get at them from one angle. So what I'm going to do is get them all from this side, and then when it's cool, I'm going to flip it over and get it from the other side. Or I guess when they're all tacked. It doesn't have to be cool. I'm just watching for those little gaps to fill. I'm watching for that glass to run into those little areas. Let's see, what are we doing at the time? That's like pretty much everything from here out is just repetitious activity. So there's 16 spokes on there. I just did 2. That leaves, what, 14 more? You don't want to see 14 more of those things happen. So I'll leave you to just extrapolate what's going to, it's done, except for 14 more joints. So, yeah. Questions?
How did you attach all those little pieces to the background? What was the background made of and what glue did you use?
Yeah, so
Assembly.
that was, those were all soft glass. And soft glass has a really similar coefficient of expansion to copper wire, or copper. So I made each little flower on copper wire, and then that left me a little stick, and then I just drilled holes in the wall and stuck the little sticks in the holes.
What kind of annealing schedule do you use?
Just standard Boro annealing schedule.
You put it in cold?
Yeah,
into
I
a
usually
cold
put stuff in
kiln?
cold, send it up, let
Okay.
it sit there for a second, send it back down. Nothing super complicated.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go.
Do you draw out all those little flowers and birds to be the same size in what you just made?
No, I do it by eye, and I'll make more of them than I need, and then just pick the ones that fit.
So the limit to the size of the piece would be the size of the kiln you could stick it in.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
As far as I know, that is the only limit. There's really big kilns out there in the world.
When you were doing most of your assemblies and working in soft glass, I assume it was harder. Did you have more breakage, and has your methodology changed since doing it in Boro?
Soft glass, you don't have to worry about cold seals at all. You can just stick stuff to stuff. You can just be like, and it's stuck on there forever. It's not going to crack at acute angles. For that reason, soft glass is easier. But all that stuff, that was all attached with copper wire. All the soft glass stuff. So I would make all those little components on copper wire and then build an armature and then wire them in. So I was cheating. All right. I guess now I clean up my mess. I'll clean up this mess now.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, and then I have other little stuff here. I just brought these as examples. If you want to come up and look at stuff, you're totally welcome to come up and look at stuff.